You've been carrying more than you needed to. Not because you were weak, not because you lacked knowledge, but because the world trained you to hold the wrong version of yourself. Somewhere along the way, the idea took root that pain was personal. That if life struck you down, it must mean you failed to be spiritual enough, strong enough, obedient enough. But that story was never yours. It was programmed into the collective mind, a myth sold by a world that forgot its own origin. As Emmet Fox once taught, the cross is not just an ancient tool of execution, it's a symbol of transformation through identity, not suffering. The moment you understand who you really are, the nature of the cross changes. It's no longer an end. It becomes a passage. So before we journey inward, I invite you to like and subscribe, but only if it truly resonates with your soul. Now, let's continue. Pain is real, but it's not ultimate. The feelings, the consequences, the sleepless nights, the emotional collapses, those are not illusions. But they are not final verdicts either. They are signals. Messages from the deeper self. Not warnings that you've failed, but reminders that you've misidentified. Because identity is everything. What you call yourself, even unconsciously, becomes the frame through which the entire world mirrors back its shape. If you see yourself as a victim of life, the world responds accordingly. If you carry the silent assumption that you are unworthy, then even love will feel threatening. And if you believe that suffering must have the last word, then freedom will feel like fantasy. That's the great tragedy. Not that people suffer, but that they interpret that suffering through a false lens. When people say life is hard, they're often telling the truth, but they rarely ask why it feels hard, and fewer still ask what life is trying to evolve in them through that hardness. Your cross may look like betrayal, or loss, or illness, or being deeply unseen in your own family. It may come wrapped in circumstances that seem unfair or unforgiving. But underneath it, beneath the external details, and the pain, and the endless questions, is a single call. Who are you really, when everything false is stripped away? And that's exactly what the cross does. It strips. It removes what was never truly you, the borrowed expectations, the inherited shame, the polished persona that helped you survive but can't take you any further. It pulls away everything the world rewarded but your soul never consented to. It doesn't destroy you, it destroys the mask. And it hurts. Because we confuse the mask with the self. The cross has never been about punishment. It's about revelation. When you begin to see that, everything changes. Your tears take on new meaning. Your inner resistance begins to soften, not because you've accepted defeat, but because you're starting to sense that something wiser is unfolding beneath the ache. You can't bypass the ache. There's no shortcut that leads around the fire. But you also don't need to drown in it. You walk through it not alone, not as a beggar, but as one being reforged by their own divine pattern. And the pattern never includes victimhood. It includes awakening. Pain is loud, but identity is louder when you let it speak. And your true identity was not born of your trauma. It was present before your first wound, and it remains untouched at your core, no matter what you've lost, no matter what you've endured. When the world shouts that you're defined by your circumstances, you must become the one who whispers back, "I remember who I am." That remembering is not always gentle. Sometimes it arrives as disruption. Jobs fall away, relationships dissolve, health takes a hit, plans collapse. And just when you think you're too tired to keep going, the moment presents itself again, inviting you to rise, not by fixing the outside, but by declaring something inside. That's the work now. Not convincing others you're okay, not collecting sympathy, not waiting for someone to rescue you from the weight, but recognizing that beneath the weight, something eternal is waking up. And it is not weak. This is the threshold, the place where you no longer ask, "Why me?" and begin asking, "Who must I become now that everything else is falling away?" That shift doesn't erase pain, but it ends confusion. And when confusion ends, your power returns, not as force, but as clarity, quiet, absolute. There is no wasted suffering when identity is present. Every heartbreak becomes a turning point. Every failure becomes refinement. Every cross becomes a path. You may not be able to change how the story started, but you are no longer the one who needs to repeat it. That old identity, the one who tolerated too much, who begged for love, who believed they were too broken to rise, is dissolving. And though part of you may grieve that version, something deeper is exhaling. You were never meant to carry the burden of being someone you're not. So here you are on the edge of a truth that doesn't need to be proven, only lived. The cross is not your enemy, it's the portal. It's what brings the false to the surface so the real can emerge. You are not here to escape suffering. You are here to transcend the belief that suffering defines you. And once that truth takes root, the cross begins to loosen its grip. When the outer world begins to break you open, it's not a sign that you're losing yourself. It's often the first clue that you're finally being returned to yourself. You've spent years, maybe decades, being told who you are. Through words spoken in anger, through roles placed upon you, through the praise you received only when you fit someone else's mold. Piece by piece, those voices shaped an image. And if you're like most, you mistook that image for your identity. But when life begins to press down not just gently, but with weight, with urgency, it is not trying to ruin you. It is inviting you to see that there's a self underneath that image. A self that's not wounded, not performing, not waiting for permission. A self that was never touched by the judgments of the world. You have not failed because you feel pain. You feel pain because you've outgrown a version of yourself you can no longer pretend to be. That is the turning point. You are not the story your ego tells about the past. You are not the labels handed to you in childhood or in crisis. And you are certainly not the fragile image that cracks under pressure. The real you is deeper than memory. It is the core of awareness itself, conscious, intelligent, untouchable. But you must meet that self deliberately. When things fall apart, the temptation is to react from habit, to fix, to numb, to analyze endlessly. But reaction is rooted in the false identity, the one that thinks its job is to preserve the mask. And the mask always fears exposure. Yet underneath all of it is the you that's never flinched. There is a clarity within you that has survived every storm. You felt it before, even if only for a second during moments of stillness, during grief that emptied you, during decisions that left you with nothing but your soul intact. That clarity isn't a passing state. It's the truth of your being. But you must claim it. No one can initiate you into yourself. That is sacred, internal work. Not even the wisest teacher can replace the moment where you look at your life not in blame, not in panic, and see that something within you was never broken, only buried. This is not about self-esteem. This is about divine memory. The cross comes, not because you were bad or weak, but because your higher nature will not allow you to keep lying to yourself. It will not let you make a home inside distortion. It will shake the foundation of every identity that was built on fear, shame, and survival. And when it does, it will feel like devastation until you realize it's liberation. You're not being crushed. You're being cracked open so you can see what was inside all along. That's the paradox. The more tightly you grip the false identity, the more suffering you feel. But the moment you stop defending it, even for a breath, peace enters. Not because your situation changed, but because your perception did. Pain exposes illusions. And when the illusion is exposed, truth stands visible. You are not a sinner being punished. You are a soul being remembered. And yet, this isn't some lofty spiritual comfort. It's not meant to float above your real struggles or silence your grief. This is practical, grounded, urgent. Because the longer you define yourself by what's falling apart, the longer you stay trapped in cycles that don't belong to you. To break free, you must see clearly. The outer pain is not random. It mirrors a disconnection within. That disconnection is not your fault, but it is your responsibility to heal. Healing doesn't mean you forget what happened. It means you stop using what happened as evidence of who you are. You can't think your way into this truth. You must stand in it, even when your circumstances are screaming the opposite, even when fear demands you collapse back into the old identity. even when you're tempted to prove your worth instead of resting in it. There is no power greater than a soul who has remembered itself in the middle of a storm. That's what you're doing now. You're not here to escape your humanity, you're here to embody divinity within it. You are the space in which pain is felt, but not the pain itself. You are the one who sees the mask, not the mask. You are the one who walks through fire and comes out more whole, not more damaged. This kind of clarity cannot be faked. It is earned through honesty, through surrender, through standing in your truth long enough for it to burn off everything that isn't real. You don't need to shout that truth to anyone. You don't need to convince the world that you're rising. You only need to stop hiding from the one identity that was never taken from you, the one that was placed in you, long before the world told you to forget it. So, if you feel weary, pause, but do not shrink. If you feel lost, look closer, not further. If you feel broken, know that you are standing at the very threshold where the false ends and the real begins. And from here, everything sacred becomes possible. The cross didn't show up to punish you. It arrived to reveal what had gone unseen for too long. There comes a point in every sincere spiritual path when life stops cooperating with your surface identity. What used to work stops working. The methods, the affirmations, even the outer obedience, they begin to dry up. Not because you've failed, but because you've reached the edge of performance. That edge is sacred. It's where the cross first appears, not as a religious symbol, not as abstract metaphor, but as a real pressure in your daily life. Something tightens, something cracks. And no matter how hard you try to hold it together, it keeps slipping. That's not chaos, that's initiation. Suffering, when it arrives at that depth, is not chaos for the sake of pain. It's design. It may not look holy on the outside. It may show up through betrayal or loss or being stripped of everything that once defined you, but the reason is always the same. Your true nature is too powerful to stay hidden behind a lie. And sometimes, lies only surface through pressure. That's why the cross had to appear. Not as punishment, but as confrontation. It confronts what you've made sacred that is not sacred. It confronts what you've labeled necessary that was only ever survival. It confronts the version of you that gained approval, but lost truth. It's not gentle. The cross rarely whispers. It comes when the soul is ready, though the ego never island. You've felt that moment before. The inner collapse when something you trusted dissolved. The stillness after shock, where you're too stunned to react and yet acutely aware that nothing will ever be the same. That's the holy ground. That's where false constructs die. Not because you're being punished, because you're being reborn. The ego wants comfort. The soul wants truth. And sometimes, those two wants are incompatible. What comforts the false self often traps the real one. So the cross becomes the great unmasker. It doesn't ask for your opinion. It doesn't wait for your permission. It simply removes what cannot stay. That removal may look like divorce, like a job ending, like being misunderstood, like losing status or income or health. It's easy to assume you did something wrong. That's the ego's reflex. If something breaks, I must be to blame. But the soul knows better. It doesn't blame, it recognizes design. And the design of the cross is always surgical. It doesn't take what's yours, it takes what's false. Sometimes the false has been in place for so long that you mistake it for safety. You defend it. You call it normal. But when it begins to rot or rupture, you face a choice. Clutch the illusion or let it die and finally meet the self behind it. That choice is painful, but it's also liberating. Because when you stop negotiating with the false, you stop suffering for the wrong reasons. You start transforming for the right ones. The world teaches you to run from discomfort, to medicate it, to distract from it, to blame others for it. But when discomfort arises as part of the cross, it isn't meant to be numbed. It's meant to be read. It's information. Something deeper is trying to emerge, and it can't fit inside your current story. So the story begins to break. You were never meant to keep everything intact. The world told you that success was in preservation, preserve the relationship, preserve the image, preserve the plan. But the soul thrives through revelation, not preservation. And when revelation comes, what no longer belongs must go. Letting it go isn't weakness, it's spiritual maturity. This is why the cross had to appear. Not because you were behind in your path, but because you were ready to be accelerated. The cross is a gate, and like any gate, it divides. It separates what was necessary for survival from what's necessary for truth. The old strength built on willpower, strategy, and fear no longer serves. A new strength must emerge. That strength isn't loud, it doesn't perform, it doesn't need recognition, it comes from clarity. It's the strength of one who knows who they are, even as the world forgets. You're not here to hold everything together. You're here to become so clear in your being that what falls apart around you no longer defines you. There is an intelligence guiding this process. You don't need to micromanage it. You only need to respond from the highest identity available to you in each moment. And when pain rises, you don't numb it. You ask it what it wants you to see. That simple act of presence, of listening, of not shrinking back, is what dissolves the unconscious grip of the false identity. You don't escape the cross by avoiding life. You transcend it by seeing through it. The old story told you that suffering proves your weakness. But the truth is, suffering only reveals where your identity is still entangled in illusion. And that revelation, though brutal at times, is mercy in disguise. Because once the lie is seen, it loses its power. And what rises in its place is not a better mask, it's you. Not the version people expect, not the version you used to perform, but the real, rooted, radiant core of who you are. And no cross past, present, or future can touch that. The cross doesn't just appear because something went wrong. It appears because something deeper is being set right. There are spiritual laws at work, silent, constant, unbending. They don't punish or reward based on mood or merit. They operate the way gravity does, impersonally, precisely, without pause. These laws govern the relationship between consciousness and manifestation. What you hold in your inner world must eventually express itself in the outer. It's not philosophy, it's mechanics. This is why pain, confusion, and crisis are not accidents. They're equations playing out formulas you've often written unconsciously, not as fault, but as participation. When the outer structure of your life begins to collapse, it's not proof that the universe is against you. It's proof that the inner blueprint is changing, and the outer world can't hold it anymore. Everything external is downstream of identity. You can't live one way in your belief and expect another way to show up in your experience. The cross becomes necessary when the internal misalignment reaches a breaking point, when what you truly are can no longer fit inside the lie you've been told to carry. So it breaks. And at first, it feels like chaos. But if you look closer, you'll see it's patterned. There's a rhythm beneath the rupture. The pattern may look like repetition at first. The same kinds of relationships, the same disappointments, the same betrayals. They aren't signs that you're stuck, they're signs that a deeper law is trying to get your attention. That law says, you cannot contradict your divine nature without consequence. Not as punishment, but as correction. The universe is not moralistic, it's intelligent. It operates by resonance. What doesn't match your soul's signature eventually disintegrates, not to hurt you, but to return you to coherence. This is why pretending doesn't work forever. You can fake happiness, fake alignment, fake belief in yourself for a while, but the law beneath your life won't respond to performance. It only responds to truth. So when the cross appears, it is not asking what you've said, it's revealing what you've lived. And what you've lived is often shaped by old contracts, agreements made in pain, silent vows like, I'll never trust again, I'll always be the one who fixes everything, I don't get to have ease. These aren't surface affirmations, they're deeper than language. They're assumptions built into your nervous system, your reactions, your silence. The cross arrives to collapse those contracts. And it will. Not by asking nicely, but by placing you into conditions where the old agreements simply cannot hold. You'll try to function the old way, and it won't work. You'll try to tolerate what you used to stomach, and it will make you sick. You'll try to hide behind intellect or politeness or numbness, and it will backfire. That is the law speaking. It doesn't rage or plead, it simply mirrors. Whatever is out of alignment with your divine pattern must fall away, or else you'll fracture under the tension of contradiction. That's not cruelty. That's higher order. But to navigate it, you have to stop fighting what's falling. You can't receive clarity while defending confusion. You can't invite healing while clinging to the behaviors that perpetuate harm. You can't become who you are while trying to preserve who you were. So the cross rises, not randomly, not cruelly, but surgically. It cuts away the masks with precision, and you can't stop it with good behavior. You can only align with it through surrender, not passive, helpless surrender, but conscious release of what you know is no longer true. This is where real power begins. Because when you accept that life operates by law, not luck, you stop begging and start responding. You become a participant, not a puppet. You become intimate with the design of things. You start to understand that every hardship was an invitation to correct your frequency, not a sentence to endure endlessly. This isn't just philosophy, it's practicality. It's the shift from, "Why is this happening to me?" to, "What in me was out of sync, and what truth is now trying to take its place?" That question doesn't blame, it empowers, because it reminds you that nothing in your life is random, and therefore nothing is unredeemable. Even the deepest pain has logic behind it. Not the logic of reason, but the logic of revelation. And once you recognize that every cross rests on a pattern, something opens inside you. You stop waiting for rescue. You begin examining the code. What did I believe before this happened? What identity was I carrying that invited this lesson? What truth have I been too afraid to fully live? Those questions don't just heal, they rewire. They place you into harmony with the unseen laws that govern your reality. And once you're in harmony, the cross no longer feels like punishment. It begins to feel like passage. Not all at once. Not without tears, but with growing clarity. You start to see that what's falling away was never yours. That the parts of you screaming the loudest were the ones you were never meant to carry in the first place. That the collapse isn't proof of failure, but the sound of falseness being removed. And in its place, space, stillness, strength. The law beneath your life does not demand perfection, it demands alignment. And when you begin aligning, you don't escape suffering, you transcend the confusion around it. You begin to walk through fire with your eyes open, knowing that everything burning was built on a lie. This is how the cross becomes a key. Not a sentence, not a punishment. A pattern-clearing device placed by a higher intelligence that will not let you betray yourself any longer. Right before the breakthrough, the false self makes its final stand. You'll feel it in the tightening, the defensiveness, the urge to fix what's falling, explain what's ending, or retreat back into the familiar. This isn't weakness, it's the ego's last attempt to survive. The ego doesn't fear pain as much as it fears irrelevance. And when the cross enters your life, it signals that the old structure, the image you've built, the mask you've worn, the compromises you normalized is no longer needed. For the ego, that feels like death. So it resists. Not just overtly, often subtly. In self-doubt masked as humility. In procrastination disguised as rest. In distraction dressed up as duty. The ego is brilliant at strategy. It doesn't scream, "Don't evolve." It whispers, "Let's do it later." It doesn't say, "I want control." It says, "I'm just trying to be responsible." But the soul knows the difference. The soul can feel when you're shrinking, even if you've dressed it in spiritual language. And during the cross, that shrinking becomes more painful than the transformation itself. Because the pressure is no longer external, it's internal contradiction. You are being invited into expansion while simultaneously clinging to smallness. That tension creates heat. It looks like anxiety, overthinking, fatigue that doesn't rest with sleep. And in that discomfort, the false self tightens its grip. It will resurrect every old narrative it can. You'll hear thoughts that sound like truths. I'm not ready. This is too much. I'm not that kind of person. I should be grateful for what I have. I need more time. These aren't just thoughts. They're defense mechanisms. They arise when the ego senses it's losing control over your identity. And that's exactly what's happening. The cross doesn't just remove what's false in your life, it removes who you thought you had to be to survive it. And that identity, even if built on pain, has become familiar. You know how to navigate it. You know how to win approval with it. You know how to avoid certain emotions by hiding behind it. So when life demands you drop it, your nervous system reacts like something vital is being taken. It doesn't know yet that you'll breathe more freely without it. That's why the ego resists so fiercely it confuses the death of the mask with the death of the self. But what's really dying is the layer between you and freedom. Let it die. Let the image that needed validation collapse. Let the role that kept you over-functioning retire. Let the performance that kept you exhausted finally end. Not because you hate those parts of you, but because they've completed their purpose. Even defense mechanisms were once survival tools. You don't need to shame them, you just need to outgrow them. That's the soul's job, not to destroy the ego, but to reclaim its seat of leadership. And in this moment, that reclamation might feel like chaos. Because the ego doesn't surrender all at once. It clings in cycles. Every time you step into your truth, it flares. Every time you move toward the unknown, it offers old scripts. You don't need to argue with those scripts. You just need to stop obeying them. That's where will comes in. Spiritual will is not about force, it's about direction. It's the calm, inner authority that says, I see the fear, but I choose the truth anyway. And each time you choose that truth, the grip of the false self weakens. Eventually, it stops offering resistance. Not because it's been destroyed, but because it's been repurposed. Your ego doesn't vanish. It becomes an instrument instead of a master. But before that shift, it fights. It's not evil, it's just scared. It doesn't know yet that your freedom doesn't mean its end. It means its elevation. So, when the cross feels heavy, ask yourself, what part of me is still trying to negotiate with what I know must be released? That's usually where the struggle island. You may find you're still trying to be liked by people who only knew your old self. You may be trying to stay loyal to environments that require your silence. You may still be asking for permission to rise. You don't need it. This is not the time to get smaller in the name of being polite. It's not the time to pretend you don't know what you know. It's not the time to delay your freedom out of fear that someone else won't understand. This is the moment to walk forward, even if your knees shake, even if no one claps, even if you grieve what you're leaving behind. The ego will scream, let it. Let it panic. Let it replay every past failure. Let it throw every guilt trip and emotional manipulation and half-true memory it can find. But don't let it dictate your next move. You're not walking backward. The cross isn't proof that you're broken. It's proof that you're becoming too real for anything that was built on pretending. So, let the false self resist. Let it say whatever it needs to say on its way out. You're no longer taking orders from fear. There's a moment on this path, subtle at first, then piercing, where you realize no one is coming to confirm who you are. No external voice will descend with a certificate of worthiness. No figure of authority, no lover, no parent, no teacher can hand you the name that already lives in your spirit. The waiting ends, not because it's fulfilled, but because you finally see it was never necessary. It's a strange grief, the kind that lingers in the corners of awakening. You start to understand that much of what you longed for wasn't the thing itself, but the permission it represented. To be chosen, to be seen, to be told you were finally enough to stop searching. But what if no one gives you that moment because it's yours to give yourself? That realization doesn't arrive with fireworks. It settles slowly, like dust after an earthquake. You stop scanning the horizon for signs and begin turning inward with new eyes. And what you find isn't grand, but it's unmistakably real. Your identity cannot be handed to you because it was never outside of you to begin with. You must declare it. Not in arrogance, not as a performance, but as quiet alignment with what you know to be unshakable, even if it's still unfamiliar. That declaration is less about language and more about direction. It's the way you rise differently, walk differently, choose differently, not to prove anything, but because you no longer need to perform for belonging. But that shift isn't always triumphant. At first, it can feel like death. Not the drama of crisis, but the emptiness that follows. The collapse of illusions leaves a silence that can terrify those who've grown accustomed to noise. It's the space where old ambitions no longer inspire, where familiar goals feel hollow, where the social rewards of the false self no longer excite you, and yet, the new self has not yet taken form. In the writings of Emmet Fox, this is the death of the personal self, the letting go of every identity stitched together by fear, approval, and adaptation. You may walk through your daily life and still smile at people, still meet your obligations, still function, but under the surface, a slow unraveling is underway. Nothing quite fits. Conversations feel off. Plans lose meaning. You wonder if you're dissolving, and in a way, you are. Not in the sense of erasure, but in the sense of release. The you that needed validation is going quiet. The you that negotiated identity through achievement is stepping aside. What remains isn't yet loud, but it is unshakably alive. This is where the cross deepens. The external trials may fade, but the internal reckoning sharpens. You begin seeing how many of your choices came from unconscious strategies to earn a sense of self. You remember how many masks you wore just to be safe. And now, with nothing left to earn, the old motivations dissolve. There's grief in that. You mourn the versions of yourself that carried you here, even if they were built on lies. You honor them, but you don't bring them forward. And in this valley, a strange thing happens. You stop seeking power and start sensing it. You no longer need to be seen in a certain light to feel solid. You can hold your truth quietly, even if no one claps. You can walk through rejection without taking it as proof of your unworthiness. That stillness isn't passive, it's potent. It's the birth of true spiritual authority, the kind that doesn't ask for agreement because it no longer feeds on consensus. Claiming identity doesn't mean shouting it from rooftops. It means refusing to abandon it when tested. It's in how you speak when your voice shakes. It's in how you walk away when staying would mean self-betrayal. It's in how you no longer chase what drains you, even if it once defined you. And it's in how you stop blaming others for not giving you what you never actually needed. There will be moments when you feel the weight of absence, no applause, no recognition, no soft arms wrapping around your effort. You'll wonder if this is what becoming yourself really feels like. Lonely, quiet, almost invisible. And the answer is yes, sometimes it does. Because the soul grows in depth before it grows in visibility. It roots before it rises. And in that rooting, you make the boldest declaration of all, not with words, but by refusing to be moved by anything less than truth. The world will offer you endless identities to wear again. Easier ones, softer ones. Roles that are praised and predictable. But once you've seen yourself in wholeness, even briefly, those masks itch. They don't settle the way they once did. You may still try them on out of habit, but something in you no longer fits inside. And that misfit is the evidence of growth. This is the real ascent, not into light, but into clarity. And sometimes clarity feels like loss. It strips away your dependencies, your illusions of control, your hope that someone else might come and relieve you of your responsibility to rise. No one is coming to crown you. And that is not a tragedy. That is liberation. Because once you no longer need to be named, you become unstoppable in your becoming. There is a point in every awakening where the impulse to escape becomes more seductive than the pain itself. The ache of transformation intensifies, and suddenly, even the old cage starts to look like home. You tell yourself it wasn't so bad, that maybe you overreacted, that maybe the pressure you feel is unnecessary. And it's in this precise moment that the spiritual crisis becomes spiritual opportunity. Because what you do with your suffering, how you interpret it, how you respond to it, determines whether it burns you or frees you. It's easier to soothe discomfort than to let it complete its work. And in a culture obsessed with relief, It's almost expected that you reach for something to dull the fire. A belief, a substance, a distraction. An identity that helps you reattach to a version of you that isn't yet dead. But each time you bypass pain, you also bypass the intelligence within it. You interrupt the message trying to emerge. You cut short the unraveling that would have liberated you from the cycle entirely. This is why the cross cannot be treated like a problem to solve. It is not a mistake to be corrected or a glitch in the flow of manifestation. It is the very architecture through which untruth collapses. When you avoid that architecture, when you run from the tension before it's done its work, you don't heal faster. You delay the breakthrough. You stay in orbit around a truth you were meant to embody. Escaping suffering is not the same as transforming it, and many spiritual seekers confuse the two. They chase elevated feelings, interpret every low as misalignment, and use the language of vibration to hide from the very discomfort that would make them real. But Emmet Fox, and others who taught from depth, made no such mistake. They understood that the presence of pain doesn't signal spiritual failure. It often signals that the soul is near the threshold of real change. True growth is not linear or painless. It's erratic. It's intimate. It doesn't care about your 5-year plan. It cares about your readiness to become who you actually are. And it will do whatever is necessary to clear the obstacles within. Sometimes gently, sometimes violently, but always with precision. That's why you must be wary of anything that promises comfort at the expense of clarity. Not every helping hand leads forward. Some lead in circles. Some tell you what you want to hear so you can stay slightly better adjusted to your suffering, rather than walk through it. And that's not healing, that's management. You weren't born to manage pain. You were born to transmute it. To transmute means to let the pain move all the way through, without flinching, without editing. It means holding yourself steady when nothing makes sense, not because you enjoy the discomfort, but because something inside you knows that running would only bring you back to the same threshold again, a little more worn, a little more guarded, a little less sure of yourself. And eventually, that looping becomes its own kind of hell. But when you stay present, something changes. Slowly at first. There's no dramatic shift, no obvious reward, just a quiet moment when the pressure stops feeling cruel and starts feeling meaningful. The weight doesn't disappear, but your relationship to it does. It's no longer something to fight. It becomes something you carry differently, not as identity, but as refinement. You start to understand that what once crushed you is now carving you. That shift in awareness is not loud, but it's irreversible. Avoiding suffering always seems logical in the beginning. It feels like self-care, like maturity, like wisdom. But there's a difference between conscious stewardship of your energy and fear-based resistance to your own evolution. One honors your path. The other keeps you circling the same internal mountain, dressed in new words but governed by old fear. This path will not coddle you, but it will hold you. And in that holding, you'll begin to feel something sacred emerge, not from your effort, but from your endurance. The kind of endurance that doesn't pretend it doesn't hurt, but also doesn't collapse from the pain. The kind that trusts the pressure is intelligent, even when it feels unbearable. You won't need to explain this to anyone. In fact, you may find it impossible to put into words, because what's happening inside you isn't for others to understand. It's between you and the unseen law that governs real transformation. And in that sacred contract, the terms are clear. You can't bypass your becoming. This is the wisdom Fox pointed to, the understanding that liberation comes through the cross, not in spite of it. That anything you try to skip over becomes the very thing that repeats. That freedom isn't found in the removal of hardship, but in the recognition of what hardship came to reveal. And so, you stop asking how to make it easier. You begin asking how to become stronger in the presence of it. Not by gritting your teeth or muscling through, but by softening into something deeper than resistance. You align, you listen, you stop bargaining, and from that surrender, something ancient rises in you. It's not the old self, improved. It's the self that never needed improvement to begin with, the self that lives beneath performance, beneath programming, beneath pain, the one that doesn't need to escape anymore because there's nothing left to run from. Only truth, only clarity, only forward. The cross that appears in your life is never truly external. What you experience as outer suffering is almost always a reflection of something held within, often invisible, often unacknowledged, but undeniably active. And until that truth is seen clearly, the pain repeats. Not because the universe is cruel, but because it is merciful enough to keep mirroring what must be understood. There's a point where this truth becomes unavoidable. When you're no longer satisfied blaming circumstances or people or even the past, you begin to suspect that what hurts on the outside is echoing something you've agreed to inside, a silent belief, a suppressed identity, a hidden story that has shaped how you interpret every experience, how you receive love, how you allow joy, how you endure pain. This is where the cross becomes a mirror. Not a weapon used against you, but a reflection held up to you. And if you can bear to look into it without flinching, you'll begin to see the architecture of your own suffering. You'll notice how often you've tolerated being unseen because somewhere you believed visibility came with danger. You'll remember how long you've overfunctioned in relationships because, deep down, you feared that being chosen without proving yourself was impossible. You'll see how often you braced for rejection, even in spaces where love was present, because love always felt conditional in the past. These patterns aren't weaknesses. They're symptoms of agreements you made long ago, agreements that made sense at the time. But now, under the intensity of the cross, they surface for what they are, outdated contracts signed by a version of you that no longer exists. And this is where transformation begins, not by fixing the outer situation, but by dissolving the inner story that gave it power. To stand before the mirror of the cross requires uncommon honesty. You don't get to pretend you've healed what you've only numbed. You don't get to call yourself empowered while secretly hoping someone else will rescue you. You don't get to speak of freedom while obeying the same internal rules that kept you caged. The cross doesn't allow it. It will reflect every inconsistency, not to shame you, but to offer you the chance to unify. That unification doesn't happen by spiritual performance. It happens by spiritual sight. You begin to see how you've participated in your own suffering, not in a way that blames or shames, but in a way that reveals your power. You see the beliefs you've entertained, the roles you've played, the energy you've spent trying to feel safe in places that never truly honored your being. And as you see more clearly, you begin to reclaim what was always yours, the right to choose differently. But that clarity comes with its own sting. There is grief in recognizing how long you stayed in distortion. How many years were spent trying to earn what could only ever be accepted? How much effort went into proving a worth that was never in question? This is the grief of awakening, and it cuts deeper than any loss because it's not about what was done to you. It's about what you're now choosing to stop doing to yourself. It's tempting, even now, to turn away from the mirror, to call it too heavy, to distract yourself with another goal, another relationship, another philosophy. But every time you turn away, the pain returns. Maybe not immediately, maybe not dramatically, but it returns because the cross doesn't disappear when you look away. It waits, quietly, precisely, until you're ready to look again. When you finally hold your gaze, when you stop negotiating with illusion and allow the mirror to show you everything, you enter sacred territory. You begin to notice the roots of your suffering, not as enemies, but as teachings. You see the moments in childhood where decisions were made in silence. You recognize the subtle choices to contract, to conform, to hide. You stop fighting those memories. You begin blessing them not because they were good, but because they brought you here. This is the rest after the fall, the soft landing after the hard truth. You no longer need to judge the past. You no longer need to fix it. You only need to stop dragging it into the present, because once you see that the cross is your own reflection, you stop trying to fight it. You let it speak. And in that letting, the cycle begins to break. That's when the mirror changes. What once showed your distortion begins to reveal your truth. What once exposed your fears begins to confirm your strength. And eventually, what once felt like punishment becomes recognition. You see yourself not the small self that reacted, but the true self that remained intact beneath the chaos. The self that watched everything unfold without ever collapsing. The self that chose to return, again and again, to presence. The cross never needed to break you. It only needed to show you what needed to be broken open. Now the mirror is clean, and in it, you don't see a victim or a mistake. You see someone who walked through the furnace, not with perfection, but with integrity. Someone who stopped reaching for escape and started standing in truth. Someone who let the mirror show every crack and still chose to keep looking. That's what makes you unshakable. You weren't called to carry your suffering. You were called to change its substance. Somewhere along the way, the idea of endurance got twisted. You were taught that strength meant holding on. That spiritual maturity looked like bearing the unbearable with a smile, waiting for reward in some distant, invisible realm. But transmutation is not tolerance. Tolerance keeps you in the same pattern, just with nicer language. Transmutation ends the pattern entirely. The cross becomes sacred not when you learn to carry it, but when you begin to change what it represents. And that change doesn't come through struggle, it comes through awareness. Pain that is witnessed without resistance begins to move. It reshapes itself the moment you stop identifying with it. That doesn't mean you pretend it's not there. It means you stop calling it mine. You stop attaching meaning to it that reinforces your limitation. You stop turning it into a story of being trapped. Instead, you begin to engage it the way fire engages wood, not with sentiment, but with purpose. The great teachers understood this. They never told you to spiritualize your suffering by making it permanent. They taught you to use it, to burn through distortion, to extract the lesson, to distill the clarity, to refine your energy until what remains is pure consciousness, free from the narratives that once defined your struggle. But to reach that clarity, something has to die. The version of you that found identity in being broken, the one that was comfortable being the strong one for everyone else, the one who secretly feared that if the pain stopped, the purpose would too. Those identities get woven into the fibers of your being, and when they're pulled out, it stings. This is the part of transformation that isn't glamorous. It's raw. You wake up one morning and realize you can no longer explain who you are using the same words. You can't relate to the same people in the same way. You no longer crave the same validation. You're not broken, but you're also not yet whole. You're becoming something else, and that in-between space is where transmutation takes place. It is not about arrival. It's about exposure. Everything still rooted in fear surfaces now. Old coping mechanisms lose their effectiveness. Emotional responses feel unfamiliar. The armor you used to wear doesn't fit, and walking without it feels like standing naked in front of life. But that vulnerability is sacred. It's the beginning of true power. Because power that comes from performance always needs reinforcement. But power that comes from alignment requires no defense. In this space, you begin to experiment. You stop reacting. You start choosing. You speak differently. Not because you're trying to sound wise, but because the old words no longer feel honest. You find yourself walking away from dynamics that once gave you a sense of worth. You sit with your discomfort instead of rushing to fix it. You breathe through the noise instead of answering to it. And slowly, you realize something profound. The pain you once feared is no longer your enemy. It has become raw material. It no longer binds you. It reveals you. Transmutation begins when you stop asking to be rescued and start asking what this fire wants to release from your system. What belief? What attachment? What version of self that served its purpose but has now become an anchor? This is not a single act. It's a rhythm, a process of showing up, again and again, to the parts of yourself that were left behind in old stories. To the voices that once said, "You'll never be enough unless," and now no longer hold weight. You begin to sense that something inside you cannot be destroyed. That's the true core, not the resilient ego, not the high-functioning pain manager, but the untouched self, the witness beneath all collapse, who has never needed to be proven, only remembered. From this place, the cross no longer feels like a punishment to endure. It becomes a forge, and you are not its victim. You are its alchemist. You'll still feel the ache. You'll still feel the pull of old ways, especially in moments of doubt or fatigue. But the difference now is that you know where that path leads. You've walked it long enough to recognize its dead ends. You no longer mistake chaos for truth or adrenaline for meaning. The desire to hold on will surface. Let it come, let it whisper, but do not follow it. Because now, you know better. You've begun the deeper work not of surviving your pain, but of turning it into light. And the only thing required is that you keep walking, not with urgency, not with a need to prove anything, but with the quiet confidence of someone who has met their own fire and stayed. That staying changes everything. The cross doesn't just strip illusions, it forces a decision. Not about the situation, not about how others see you, but about the one thing that changes everything: will. Not the will to control, to perform, to force outcomes into neat arrangements. The kind of will that the soul knows. The will to choose who you are when no outcome is guaranteed. When the story you've lived starts to dissolve and no new title has replaced it yet, will is what stands between collapse and clarity, not because it always feels strong, but because it insists on standing anyway. There comes a moment during suffering, sharp, unmistakable, where you realize no one is going to lift you across the threshold. The tools won't do it, the prayers won't do it, the teachings won't do it. The people you once leaned on may not be able to understand this chapter, not because they don't love you, but because this choice can't be shared. It can only be made from the inside. You either fold into the version of yourself shaped by fear, or you rise not with noise, not with drama, but by claiming the authority to live differently from this moment forward. And that is not a passive realization, it is an act. It happens in the silence after the tears, in the days when nothing feels resolved, in the middle of pain that still pulses. It happens not when the fire has died down, but while it's still burning. You reach into the ash and pull out your name, not the one others gave you, not the one your trauma tried to erase, but the one etched into your being long before this world tried to tame it. And in that moment, even if nothing outside changes, something massive shifts within. Because you've stopped waiting for life to fix itself before you choose. You've stopped using the chaos as an excuse to delay your power. You've stopped bargaining with the future. You decide. This is the true essence of resurrection power. It doesn't arrive after suffering ends. It arrives in the middle of it, when the outer facts say collapse is inevitable, but something in you refuses to shrink. That kind of will is not loud. It's not armored. It's not born of bravado. It is silent, steady, and unbreakable. And it changes the energetic blueprint of your entire experience. Because life responds to decision, not to wishful thinking, not to mental rehearsals of what you hope to one day become. Life bends to clarity of identity. And when you choose to see yourself as whole, even before you feel healed, reality begins rearranging around that frequency. That's why the cross isn't just about endurance, it's about activation. Pain without decision hardens you. It loops you into cycles of self-preservation. It teaches you to cope instead of transform. But when pain is met with decision, it becomes fuel. It burns away dependency. It burns away delay. And in the ashes, will rises not as effort, but as essence. You won't always feel ready. You won't always feel strong. But decision doesn't require emotion. It only requires alignment. When Neville Goddard taught of assuming the state of the wish fulfilled, he wasn't teaching fantasy. He was pointing to this very truth. That decision must precede the evidence. You must claim what is yours before the world reflects it. Because the world is not a source, it is a mirror. And that mirror will not shift until you do. So you choose. You choose to speak differently. You choose to stop managing people's perceptions. You choose to rest where you used to hustle for validation. You choose to set boundaries where you used to seek approval. You choose to release shame that never belonged to you. You choose not because the conditions are perfect, but because truth waits for no one. And yes, you will feel the fear, the loss, the disorientation. Decision doesn't erase that, it simply ends your negotiation with it. It turns your gaze forward, not with haste, but with precision. This is the will the cross awakens. The will to live from essence, not ego. The will to walk as someone who no longer fears what might fall away. The will to carry your truth into rooms that are not yet ready for it and speak anyway. The will to stay loyal to what's real, even if it costs you comfort. You may feel like you're walking alone, and in a sense, you are. Because the path of will is narrow not in opportunity, but in clarity. It does not allow for half commitments. It asks for everything, and it gives you everything in return. When the fire burns, and it feels like the world is watching to see what you'll become, you don't need to announce your transformation. You just walk forward. Not with explanations, not with apologies, but with presence. And that presence is what changes rooms. Not your image, not your story, but the stillness of someone who knows who they are. This is how the cross is transcended, not by waiting, not by hoping, but by choosing. There's a moment after the fire, after the decision, when everything still looks the same, but it no longer feels the same. The landscape hasn't changed, but you have. You stop looking for signs that it's time to move. You stop asking for confirmation from circumstances, because something within you is already decided. And from that decision comes authority, not the kind the world gives, but the kind you carry in silence. Spiritual authority doesn't mean you never doubt. It means you no longer obey the doubt. You see it, you recognize its voice, and you move anyway. Not because you're unaffected, but because you're no longer ruled by what used to define you. This is the threshold where authority is reclaimed, not granted, not bestowed by others. Taken back not with force, but with clarity. It becomes unbearable to keep explaining your pain. Not because the pain is gone, but because the story no longer fits. The part of you that once needed others to validate your wounds begins to dissolve. You stop needing to be seen in a certain way. You stop rehearsing your suffering in conversations, trying to make it legible to those who can't understand it. Not out of resentment, but because the narrative has reached its end. It can no longer hold your becoming. This is the part of the journey where old dialogues fall silent. You realize how much energy you spent justifying your truth, justifying your boundaries, justifying your decisions. And now, that energy returns to you. You stop negotiating your identity in real time. You simply embody it. That embodiment is quiet at first. It shows up in how you sit with yourself when the world is loud, in how you walk away from patterns that once seduced you, in how you stop trying to fix what no longer resonates. Authority isn't about having all the answers. It's about standing rooted in who you are, even as the questions keep coming. And the questions will come. Life will test what you've claimed, not as punishment, but as confirmation. The moment you declare your truth, the cross will echo. It will return in subtler forms, presenting opportunities to abandon your alignment. And in those moments, your job is not to panic, not to perform, but to remain. To remain loyal to what you've already chosen. To remain steady when the old roles call your name. To remain present in the face of the familiar pull to shrink. Because authority grows through consistency, not declarations. It becomes your nature when it is practiced, not just proclaimed. You'll begin to notice the shift in how you relate to others. Where once you might have absorbed their discomfort, you now hold your ground. Where once you over-explained, you now speak simply and move forward. Where once you waited for consensus, you now trust your inner compass. Not to rebel, not to dominate, but to lead yourself, first and foremost. Because real authority isn't about power over others. It's about sovereignty within. You know you've reclaimed it when peace replaces performance. When your presence speaks louder than your words. When you no longer look to others to define your value or explain your worth. When your decisions are aligned not with fear, but with inner congruence. There will still be moments of fatigue, of doubt, of wanting to be understood. But those moments won't last as long. You'll recover faster. You'll stop building your identity around the need for validation. You'll begin to walk as someone who remembers that the cross was never a punishment. It was a purifying fire, and you're no longer afraid of the flames. The authority you reclaim here is not just spiritual, it is practical. It touches every aspect of how you live, how you set boundaries, how you say no without guilt, how you claim space without apology, how you rest without proving your productivity, how you speak without seeking permission. That kind of authority doesn't make noise. It doesn't announce itself, but its presence is unmistakable. People feel it when you enter a room, not as intimidation, but as coherence. There's nothing to hide, nothing to exaggerate. You simply are, and that being becomes your influence. Not everyone will celebrate this shift. Some will be confused. Some will fall away. Some will try to pull you back into familiar roles that no longer fit. Let them go. Let the roles go. Let the version of yourself who once tolerated being misunderstood for the sake of belonging finally exhale. Because now, you don't need to belong anywhere that asks you to leave yourself behind. This is what the cross was making room for all along. Not just survival, not just healing, but dominion, quiet dominion over your inner world. The kind of dominion that says, I choose what I allow, I define what I accept, I command my direction not with force, but with unwavering presence. And from that place, even suffering begins to lose its grip. Because it can no longer attach itself to the identity you've released. It can no longer feed on the roles you've abandoned. It finds no echo in your being. And without that echo, it fades. What remains is essence. What remains is strength that no longer needs to prove itself. What remains is the voice that rises in stillness and speaks only when truth is ready to be heard. This is what reclaiming authority looks like. Not a crown, not a spotlight, but a spine. A stillness, a clarity that no longer moves at the command of fear. And from here, everything changes. There comes a time when you stop reaching, not because you've grown indifferent, not because you've given up, but because something inside you has matured past the hunger for approval. You no longer chase recognition dressed as love. You no longer confuse sacrifice with value. And most of all, you no longer beg spiritually, emotionally, or energetically. The posture of begging is subtle. It can hide beneath even the most refined intentions. You think you're asking life for a sign, but you're really asking to be spared from stepping into your own power. You think you're praying for direction, but what you really want is someone else to make the decision for you. You say you're surrendering, but you're still secretly hoping to be rescued. But rescue never arrives, at least not in the way you once imagined. Because there is nothing to be rescued from when you're already standing in the center of your own authority. The cross has done its work. It stripped away the identities that depended on external permission. It burned off the performance, the desperation, the illusion that worth must be earned through suffering. Now what's left is raw, unsentimental, and deeply powerful. You begin to notice how much of your spiritual life was built on bargaining. How many of your prayers were really negotiations in disguise? How many of your declarations were rehearsals of what you hoped would finally be enough to gain favor from the universe, from others, from some imagined spiritual hierarchy? But that phase is over. You don't need to earn the right to be whole. Wholeness was the premise, not the prize. You begin to move through the world differently now, not because your problems have vanished, but because you no longer interpret your value through them. You stop internalizing delay as denial. You stop translating silence as rejection. You no longer interpret difficulty as divine punishment. You stop assuming the absence of applause means you're on the wrong path. You've outgrown the metrics of the false self, the scorekeeping, the waiting for a breakthrough to confirm your faith, the subtle fantasy that, one day, life will finally recognize all that you've endured and hand you a crown. The crown was never coming because it was never withheld. It was always yours to wear, but you had to be stripped enough to reach for it without arrogance and without apology. Now, when you ask differently, not from lack, not from fear. You ask from alignment, from authority, from the clarity that comes with knowing you're not pleading with life, you're conversing with it. You recognize that the divine is not some external dispenser of favor, monitoring your worthiness on a cosmic scale. It is the very intelligence within you, awaiting your willingness to embody what has always been true. And so, you stop begging. You speak what is yours with calm certainty. You take what is needed without guilt. You stop performing humility when what's actually required is courage. You stop diluting your essence to seem more acceptable. You stop waiting for anyone to name what you already know. And in this release, something exquisite happens. There's space again. The mental static quiets. The emotional spikes flatten. You begin to sense the intelligence of life flowing through you, not as reward but as rhythm. You become synchronized with a deeper current, not because you fought for it, but because you stopped resisting it. You realize that begging was never about the thing you wanted. It was about the part of you that still thought you had to earn your place. And now that part is gone. Not vanished without pain, but surrendered through fire. There is grief in letting go of the one who begged. That version of you carried hope the only way it knew how. But you are no longer them, and though you carry their memory, you no longer carry their posture. You no longer bend yourself around rejection. You no longer contort your energy to avoid being misunderstood. You stand, simply, fully, without explanation. And because of that, people may fall away. Expectations may shift, dynamics may crumble, but none of it will feel like loss. It will feel like clarity. Because begging wasn't just in your words, it was in how you shaped your life around needing something from outside to feel complete. And now that the source has returned inward, your movement becomes precise. You don't waste energy proving. You don't chase what contracts you. You don't explain yourself into exhaustion. This is what it means to come home. Not to a place, not to a community, not even to a practice. To yourself. To the self that never asked for permission. To the self that remembers what was forgotten under the weight of needing to be enough. And from that place, life becomes less about striving and more about listening. You begin to respond instead of react. You begin to receive without apology. You begin to know without explanation. The cross didn't deliver you to this moment by mistake. It brought you here so you could see. Your worth is not up for negotiation. Your identity is not on trial. Your voice is not waiting for someone to echo it. You have nothing to prove. And finally, you believe it. Grace does not always arrive with soft hands. Sometimes it crashes through your life like an unseen tide, pulling away everything that cannot stand beside your truth, not to hurt you, not to teach you a lesson, but to align you so precisely with what is real, there's no longer room to tolerate anything that isn't. We speak of grace like it's gentle, like it whispers you into healing. And sometimes it does. But more often, grace appears as the sharp edge of disruption, the plan that falls apart, the relationship that cracks under pressure, the moment when nothing makes sense and everything familiar slips from your grip. In that space, it's easy to assume grace has left the room. But that's when it's doing its deepest work, because it's not here to comfort who you used to be. It's here to clear the path for who you truly are. Grace is not indulgence. It doesn't allow you to linger in what drains you. It won't support your participation in lies, no matter how well-dressed they are. It has no tolerance for your excuses, even the eloquent ones. Because grace isn't sentimental, it's surgical. It cuts where you've settled. It disturbs what's become too familiar. It shows you where you've confused peace with avoidance. The kind of grace that heals doesn't always feel like healing at first. It can feel like destruction. Because it doesn't rescue your illusions, it removes them, not with cruelty, but with unwavering clarity. You prayed for alignment, and this is what it looks like. And in that intensity, you'll be tempted to call it unfair, to grieve what's been taken, to doubt the path you once swore you trusted. That's natural. But if you stay long enough in the fire, you'll begin to feel what's really happening. Grace is removing what cannot survive in your next chapter. It's not rejecting you, it's refining you. It will touch areas you thought were healed. It will activate wounds you buried under productivity. It will dissolve identities you outgrew long ago, but never gave yourself permission to release. Because this isn't about optimization, it's about consecration. You're not being improved, you're being aligned. The more fiercely you try to hold on to the old life, the more painful the alignment becomes. But the moment you stop fighting it, something shifts. Grace becomes less of a storm and more of a current. You stop resisting the pull and start moving with it. That's when the pieces begin to fall into place, not the old pieces you lost, but new ones you didn't know you had room for until everything else was cleared. You begin to recognize grace not in what you receive, but in what you can finally release. The arguments you no longer need to win, the expectations you no longer carry, the cycles you no longer repeat, the mask you no longer wear. And something deeper returns to you, your capacity to stand without performing. This grace doesn't offer easy comfort. It offers liberation. It doesn't tell you everything's fine, it tells you the truth, and trust that you're strong enough to face it. It doesn't wrap you in false hope. It roots you in the kind of clarity that cuts through confusion and reminds you what matters. And what matters now is your alignment with the real. You stop bending to fit into rooms that shrink your presence. You stop translating your intuition to make it palatable to people who aren't meant to walk with you. You stop giving energy to stories that ask you to deny your power. That's the sharpness of grace. It demands integrity. Not the moral kind. This isn't about being good. It's about being whole. You start to feel when your words betray your knowing. You notice when your posture leans toward approval instead of truth. You recognize when your energy is divided, and you make the correction not from guilt, but from love. This is what inner precision feels like. It's not tense, it's clear. It doesn't require perfection. It only requires presence. And the more present you become, the more easily grace can do its work, not by fixing you, but by illuminating the parts of you that were never broken. There is no timeline here, no final arrival. Grace keeps working as long as you keep choosing truth over comfort. And the more you choose, the more natural it becomes. Your default shifts. You no longer brace for collapse. You trust what falls away. You no longer chase connection that costs your coherence. And in that space, life becomes simpler. Not easier, but more honest. The clutter clears, the pretending stops, the endless search for signs quiets. Because you're no longer asking, what should I do to be worthy? You're asking, what already aligns with who I am? That question changes everything. Because grace will answer it, not with a feeling, but with a path. And now, you're ready to walk it. Resurrection doesn't begin when your circumstances shift. It begins when your mind does. You may wait for the apology, the opportunity, the miracle, but none of those open the door. The door opens the moment you stop seeing yourself through the lens of damage and start recognizing the truth that's been dormant beneath the narrative. And that truth never needed validation. It only needed space. There's a point where you stop asking the world to reflect your healing and start becoming the reflection yourself. That's when resurrection begins. Not as a feeling, but as a decision. Not as a dramatic event, but as an inner movement so steady and unmistakable that it changes the terms of your presence in the world. You no longer approach life as the one who's trying to recover. You approach as the one who remembers. This shift doesn't come easily. It demands the full death of the old mental frame, the subtle but constant belief that life is happening to you, that others still owe you, that time has somehow stolen something unrecoverable. These thoughts may not scream, but they shape everything. And until they're surrendered, they anchor you to the very suffering you've been praying to transcend. To rise, you must stop building your identity around what hurt you. It doesn't mean you pretend the pain didn't happen. It means you stop assigning it the authority to define what happens next. You stop using it as the reason you can't speak clearly, walk boldly, choose freely. You acknowledge it, you bless it, but you no longer obey it. In this moment, the inner terrain shifts. You realize you've been waiting for a resurrection event, something external to lift you out of this heaviness. But resurrection is a mental act. It's not something that happens to you. It's something you do with your mind, your will, your clarity. You declare, I am not the one who was left. I am the one who remained. That declaration doesn't erase the grief, but it begins to reorder it. You stop using your pain to buy sympathy and start using your awareness to create something new. You recognize that no outer shift will matter until your internal frame of reference is rebuilt. And that frame is constructed by choice, one unglamorous moment at a time. You choose to see differently, to speak differently. You begin filtering your thoughts through the lens of truth, not habit. The self you were becoming was never lost. It was waiting for you to stop resisting the silence where it speaks. That silence is sacred. It's not a void, it's a reset. And within it, you begin telling the truth, not the embellished version, not the survival script, but the real story. I forgot who I was. I attached to things that reflected my fear. I spent years trying to heal while still making decisions from my wound, and now I choose differently. That is resurrection. Not just rising, but choosing to stop living from a version of yourself shaped entirely by what went wrong. It may feel unnatural at first. Resurrection often does. There's discomfort in choosing joy when pain still has receipts. There's dissonance in showing up fully when your nervous system still expects rejection. But you keep showing up anyway, not to prove anything, but to train your system in what it's like to live without the cross as your primary identity. Because that's the real danger, not that pain happened, but that it became the reference point for every thought, choice, and belief. When you no longer carry pain as your identity, resurrection becomes the new framework. It's not about pretending you're above struggle. It's about knowing that struggle is no longer the blueprint. And that awareness begins to restore your sense of agency. You stop bracing for life. You start engaging it. You allow joy not as a reward, but as a right. You experience clarity without guilt. You live without always needing to justify your peace, because you remember that the cross was a moment, not a label. The fire was a chapter, not your name. The people around you may not understand this version of you. That's okay. You didn't rise for applause. You rose because staying buried beneath the old story was no longer compatible with the truth pulsing through you. You don't need to speak about the resurrection. You embody it. You walk differently, not with force, but with coherence. You speak without explaining, love without compromising, move without apology. And in doing so, you become a mirror for others, not by trying to be an example, but simply by refusing to shrink back into the grave of your former self. This is the miracle. It's not flashy, it's not sentimental. It's a clean shift in inner command. You no longer seek escape. You choose emergence. You rise without waiting. The cross was never the end. It only looked that way from the middle. It looked like defeat when everything familiar dissolved. Like silence where there once was certainty. Like emptiness where identity used to live. But what died wasn't you. It was the version of you that couldn't follow where your soul was going. And the absence that followed wasn't a void. It was a clearing. From here, the terrain feels different. You still remember the ache, but you no longer organize your decisions around it. You still carry the echoes, but they don't guide your steps. The gravity of the old story is still nearby, but now it pulls at you with less force because your center of mass has shifted. Your point of reference is no longer what you've lost, but what you've reclaimed. You've stopped reaching for the cross like a symbol of identity. It no longer represents your struggle. It represents your choice, the decision to walk through suffering without worshiping it, to let it strip you without letting it define you, to rise not in spite of the fire, but because of what it burned away. You don't need to reframe your pain anymore. You've seen it for what it island, and because of that, it has no more power over you. You don't analyze it, justify it, dress it in metaphors. You simply nod. You acknowledge its role. You keep walking. And what you walk with now is not the burden of memory, but the clarity of presence. You move without apology. You choose without flinching. You belong to yourself in a way that requires no explanation, no translation, no permission. The world around you might still look the same, but the world within you is reordered. The noise that once ruled your thoughts has quieted. The expectations that once shaped your posture have loosened. And the shame that once colored your voice has fallen away, word by word, until all that remains is truth. You live from that truth now, not because it's easier, but because it's non-negotiable. It is the baseline, the origin, the return point, the answer to every old question you used to ask through tears. Who am I? Why did I have to break? What was the point of the pain? You don't need those answers in words anymore. You are the answer. Your wholeness is the explanation. Your freedom is the evidence. Your peace is the proof. And as you stand here wiser, quieter, realer than you've ever been, you understand what the cross was trying to show you from the beginning, that nothing can be taken from you that is truly yours, that no amount of collapse can undo what you were born to remember, that the deepest suffering only ever had one assignment, to return you to your original, untouchable self. So you bless the fire, you bless the silence, you bless the seasons where nothing made sense, and you kept showing up anyway. You bless the parts of you that once begged and broke and endured, and you bless what came through you in their place: presence, clarity, command, love. The cross brought you here, but it cannot follow you past this point. Its work is complete, and yours is just beginning. You've walked through fire, not just to survive, but to awaken. And now, as this journey comes to a close, let yourself rest not in exhaustion, but in recognition. You've seen what most people spend lifetimes avoiding. You've stood inside the furnace of unmaking, and witnessed what remains when falsehood burns away. And what remains is not a better version of who you were. What remains is real. There's no need to rush forward. The wisdom you've uncovered does not demand momentum, it asks, only for presence. Let this presence wrap around you like a quiet certainty, the kind that doesn't need to speak to be known. You are no longer reaching for truth outside of yourself. You are no longer hoping to be rescued from what you were born to transmute. You've stopped bargaining with life. You've started listening to it. And it listens back. This moment is not an end, it's a threshold, not towards something dramatic, but towards something steady, the kind of peace that comes when identity no longer requires explanation, the kind of strength that walks softly because it no longer needs to prove. Let the old story fade. Let the noise grow quiet. Let the impulse to prove or explain or defend dissolve in the stillness of knowing who you are. And if echoes from the past return, you'll know what to do. Not because the pain won't try again, but because you no longer organize your life around it. You've remembered. That was always the point. So rest now. You are not lost. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are home.